Hey, everybody. Welcome to the Open Sketchbook podcast. This is episode 5, our second host led episode. I'm your host, Evan Kitson. Today, we're going to be looking at a productivity technique to make the most of our somewhat limited time. Every January, I make a New Year's resolution and I immediately run out of steam on it by February. And when I was looking into that this year, one of our amazing community members, Kenzie, introduced me to this notion of instead of a New Year's resolution, which feels like a big commitment and this thing that you have to uphold, right? Some kind of oath to yourself. What if you were to choose a single word that sort of sets the tone for your year and becomes this kind of guiding light? And, it's kind of a mix of a manifestation and a resolution, but I landed on productivity. And I'm really happy that Kenzie introduced me to this notion because almost immediately I started seeing other folks take on this single word practice for their year. And I don't think I would have given it the attention that I did had it not been for Kenzie kind of laying that out for me. So I've been taking my word of the year, which is productivity, and I've been thinking about how can I make the most of my limited time? How can I do more when I can't really offer more to my schedule, right? I sent out a couple of educational surveys on Instagram and to my email list. And what I found was at least 50% of the people that responded said that they don't have enough time for their creative practice, which is alarming, but it also kind of makes me feel good because I never feel like I have enough time to do everything that I want to do. If you're anything like me, you have way too many ideas and a very finite amount of creative energy or time within your very busy day to day schedule. And so I wanted to take a beat and focus on one of my favorite time management tactics, the Pomodoro Technique. Part of my productivity vision, if you will, for this year has been to start a blog, start a weekly newsletter, and of course, to start this podcast, which we launched 2 weeks ago, which honestly, it kind of feels like a lifetime ago. It's been a very busy couple of weeks. And I really appreciate you being here, listening to this, watching this on YouTube. If you're not watching this on YouTube, this one actually might be worth putting a pin in and finding your way online because, unlike the other episodes, this one's going to have a visual component to it that I think really will enhance the experience. When I wrote my blog post on the Pomodoro technique, I actually put it into practice and did a drawing so I would have some illustrations for it. And I recorded the entire thing. So that demo is going to be what's playing over this episode on YouTube. So that way it's not just people staring at me talking to my camera. So with that out of the way, what is the Pomodoro technique? How is it going to help us? The Pomodoro Technique is a time management method developed by Francesco Ciarello in the late 1980s. Time chunking is one of my favorite strategies. It's something that we instinctively consider when we're planning out our time in order to make the most of it and have a clear plan in front of us. The Pomodoro Technique utilizes time chunking by breaking up your time into active periods and rest periods. When I first learned about this method, breaking up your available time into action blocks and rest blocks, it reminded me a lot of how we work with the life models in the classroom. Commonly, when we get to work and collaborate with life models, we'll go 20 minutes on with our active block with the life model in pose, and then we'll engage the rest block, which is about a 5 minute break to let them relax, recoup, and recalibrate their own body before working on the resumption. Typically, after about 3 rounds of 20-minute chunks, we'll take a longer break so everybody can rest and focus up, but that depends on the institution. Some ateliers I've worked for will go 4 20-minute chunks. They'll push it to 25-minute chunks. Some undergraduate programs will work in 15-minute blocks. Everyone's a little different. I remember when I was a student, one of the things I found a little strange, and I can't really imagine life models doing this now, although some people do, is we would work in 45-minute chunks with models actually holding the pose for 45 minutes at a time. I cannot tell you how much I do not recommend that practice. There's a few reasons why. First, I don't think 45-minute chunks are good for anybody, either the model or the artist working. I think we do need breaks to get distance from our work and recalibrate ourselves, not just a physical break for the life models, but also a mental break for us. Two, it's really irresponsible, in my opinion, to keep a life model in a very active pose for longer than 20 minutes. Now, every model will know their own body well enough to know if they can safely resume and hold a pose for any length of time. However, I cannot stress enough that no model should be injured so we can draw for an extra 5 minutes. Since we're on the topic, Pomodoros in their initial conception are about 25 minutes in length. However, I really advocate for using 20s. This way we can practice making the most of that time chunk in and out of the classroom. In my experience, the most common active time where a life model will be imposed and students and the instructor are working and teaching is about 20 minutes on and 5 off. I highly recommend that rhythm. It breaks up the entire day very nicely. After you practice this enough, your body kind of develops its own internal time clock where you can feel the 20 minutes winding down. It's not uncommon for myself or even my students after about half a semester to ask, is the timer about to go off? And there will be within like a 30-second window of when the timer is actually going to go off. If you practice this at home, you're building that intuitive time skill set where you feel the time pass without really thinking about it. And so you can start to plan how you're going to utilize that time really well in your own creative practice. Now, I don't always use the Pomodoro technique in my own studio. I like being a little bit more free, especially in the classroom where everything's much more structured. When I get out of the classroom, one of the ways I separate my creative practice from in the room to out of the room is to remove certain structured restrictions, and time is a big part of that. I like having a studio where time can just stop and I can just work. However, if I start to notice that my classroom work is lagging, such as like if my demos run longer than I'd prefer, or if I'm constantly asking, like, hey, would you mind doing just another 5 minutes in this pose? Or I don't get around to every student as quickly as I would like to, I will put the 20 on 5 off technique into practice in my own studio. It's all about building that experiential time sensibility. The more I stick with it, the less unfocused I feel, the more I start to plan my chunks of time very responsibly, and I become genuinely more productive. So, where does the name Pomodoro come from? What's the deal with that? Why don't we just call it time chunking or 20-minute active blocks or something like that? It's because Francesco named this after the tomato shaped kitchen timer that he used when he developed this time management strategy, which I love. I love things that are named after shapes. It reminds me of anatomy, things like the deltoid, which is named after delta, or the trapezius, obviously named after trapezoid. And so anything that's shape based in its name has a soft spot in my heart. Now, you don't need a tomato shaped timer to do this method. Any timer will work for you, but you do need an external timer. And I strongly recommend that it's not your phone. Anything that we can do to keep our devices that are filled with distractions, that are literally built to take your attention away and focus on them, is something that I think you should work on just setting aside. So there are a lot of really great kitchen timers on the internet that you can find. You can go to a craft store and find an egg timer. And I like having that separate timer whose only job is to keep track of these active and rest blocks. So if you're watching on YouTube, hopefully I've explained why I'm drawing a tomato. Pomodoro is Italian for tomato, and that's where it gets its name, which is kind of charming. Tomato is actually a really amazing form to draw and sculpt. There's that ages old idea that living form expresses itself outwards and that there's no concavities in the human form. I disagree with that. However, I like the sentiment that it represents. The idea that you can visually tell a form that's alive and full and fresh. A tomato is that form. So if you're looking for a fun drawing exercise, go buy a tomato and draw it. If you're looking for an incredibly difficult sculptural exercise, go get a tomato and sculpt it. Try to strike the balance of full form and volume with also attaining the surface tension of a tomato. You wouldn't think it would be difficult, but it actually is. It's a great way to level up from the bell pepper exercise for any of my art students that happen to be listening. So, okay, you have a chunk of time, you have this technique that you want to implement to utilize the most of your time, and you have your creative goal. So for me, I'm drawing a tomato. For you, it could be anything. It could be a creative effort like a self portrait, a still life, working with a figure model, timing your plein air activities. It could be a deliverable at work. It doesn't only have to be the traditional creative practice. You could introduce this into any aspect of your scheduled time. So once you know how much time you have to dedicate to working on something, you can plan how many 20-minute active time chunks can loosely fit into that total time, but you have to make sure you account for the 5-minute breaks in between those active chunks. If you're going to be engaging with more than 3 20-minute chunks, if you're looking at maybe 5 or 6, I would strongly encourage you to take one of those active 20-minute chunks and turn it into a 15-minute break. I like to introduce a 15-minute break after 3 active chunks. Breaks are incredibly important, and getting that mental breather, getting that distance is crucial to maintaining your focus and staying on task. Now, in this method, the main active chunk is called a Pomodoro. It's called a tomato, and you need to give yourself mental breathers between Pomodoros. Please use that rest time to get up, walk around, check your messages quickly. Don't get sucked into your phone, but grab a quick snack. I'll typically walk away from what I'm doing for a few minutes, spend the rest of the time reflecting on how I'm going to use the next time chunk. Think about it almost like you're a boxer in the ring and the bell's gone off. You get to step back and just recalibrate. You get to take a drink, think about how it's been going, and envision how you're going to bring it home. I never really was taught as a student how to manage my time well, and that's a shame because I really needed that. What would happen is I would procrastinate like you wouldn't believe, and then the deadline would approach very quickly, always faster than I would think. And I'm notorious for underestimating how much time something will actually take me, kind of like this podcast. And I found myself treating everything as if it was a test, meaning that I would sprint through every homework assignment since I was in like 6th grade all the way up until grad school. And the problem with that is assignments are not tests. Assignments are check-ins, they're practice, they're teaching opportunities. And if you treat every homework assignment as if it is a test, you're kind of not engaging in the lesson, and you're not going to be able to retain information as well. You're not going to walk away with what you need to know to be able to utilize it in your everyday life. So, if you're like me and you're kind of starting from zero when it comes to time management, one of the things that's been very helpful for me in retraining myself and teaching myself these things, and also passing it on to my art students and now on to you all, is list making. It sounds a little silly and maybe a little over prepared, but when I know I have a bunch of free time, I can't just dive into something like the Pomodoro method and say right out of the gate, I'm going to spend 3 20-minute sessions on something. Because what happens for me is I treat it like linear time. I start the task and I work until the timer goes off, and I force myself to take a break, and then I dive back in when I'm allowed to, and so on and so forth until the time runs out and I go, oh, I guess I'm done. The problem with that is you're not really reflecting on how you're best utilizing that time. I really advocate for taking those 5-minute breaks to recalibrate your thinking, reassess your goal, and to have a plan before you even begin. That way, you know what you're doing. You know that it's a good decision and you're not just tackling something in front of you, but rather you're thinking very strategically and very mindfully about what it is you truly want or need to accomplish with this time block. So, yeah, I will make a list. I will write out each 20-minute session on a large post-it size note page, and then I'll just list bullet points of the main things I'd like to accomplish. It's really important that if you put this into practice, that you don't over-engineer the list. The list should only be a tool to get your head in the game and to think about how to best utilize the time you're about to engage in. If you write very complete sentences, you're going to end up giving yourself a report along with less time. So you have to make sure that it's only enough to be actionable, only enough to get your head on straight. In fact, I find that after I make the list, I never return to it. So just taking a beat, writing out the 20-minute chunks, and then writing in maybe 3 bullet points for each 20-minute chunk what the main goals are going to be, and developing a strategy for how I'm going to actually use my time now that I've made myself aware of how much time I have. And maybe that's the most important quality of this strategy, is it makes you aware of the time you actually do have. I was amazed when I started doing this for a few months that I was not really aware of how much time was available to me, and then I was using that time very poorly when I was engaging with it. The Pomodoro method really, really helped get my head on straight and develop realistic goals over time. Now, for the artist, I am going to recommend a set schedule based on what I believe to be very common teaching practices in higher ed. Most studio classes run for 2.5 to 3 hours. Some run from 5 to 6 hours. So I'm going to advocate that you practice 3 times 20-minute sessions with 5-minute breaks in between them. And after those 3 little Pomodoros, I recommend taking a 15-minute break. And then if you would like to, start over again. In the classroom, that typically takes us through the first half of the day. And then we'll take a long lunch break or a dinner break before coming back and doing it all over again. Originally, a standard Pomodoro technique would utilize 4 Pomodori. But I think sticking to 3 is probably the best route for adaptability, both in the studio and in the classroom. And of course, the original method uses 25-minute chunks, but again, I highly recommend 20-minute chunks. And I really want to underscore that keeping a model in pose for over 20 minutes is not ideal, and I don't think there's any reason to do it. So just a quick check-in on the demo that's playing on YouTube right now. I'm working with graphite on hand-toned shellacked paper, which is a lot of fun. It has a really interesting tooth, a really interesting grab, and the graphite feels dark and full and really fun to work with. I definitely made great use of the blending stump in order to change the tone, the timbre, the texture of the page and the drawing, and really play with that reflective light. Also, I'm a hatch guy, and so it was a lot of fun getting in there and just carving out the forms of the tomato. So thinking a little sculpturally, but also really reveling in the different paths and currents that are available to me. Limiting myself only to 3 20-minute active blocks was, I think, a really great decision. It forced me to develop priorities, to recalibrate the drawing and how it was going in the moment, and having that sketch deadline at the very end, where no matter what, the drawing will be finished at the end of this time chunk, was so helpful. So often, my sketches and my studies are abandoned after a long time sort of passes, where the idea of the resolve makes itself obvious over time, but maybe not initially because my starting strategy isn't really developed. So by sitting there at the beginning for a few minutes and planning it out with a list, I was able to kind of focus up and have a very clear end goal in mind and work towards it. It's not the strategy I always use. However, it's absolutely effective. And that's about it for the Pomodoro technique. There really isn't too much to it, which is why it's so easy to engage with and immediately bring it into your practice. You don't have to really learn much just to say, well, let's just try it. If you're an artist, I definitely recommend it, especially for your sketches or studies. And if you're not an artist, but you find that your time slips away from you, no matter what it is, try using the technique. It's made for time management, not just for creative pursuits. And if you're interested in learning more about lists, or studying productivity, most of my early newsletters actually focused on that. I have a weekly newsletter called The Drawing Board. And for the month of January and for some of February, I talked a lot about creative productivity. It's something that strangely doesn't get a lot of love in the classroom, and it's things that we all have to teach ourselves here and there. But there are practices that are proven to deliver results and help us, especially if you're like me and you were never really shown different methods to really help you. So don't be like I was when I was a student and just aimlessly tackle things as they come and treat everything like a test or a hurdle just to jump over. I'll have a link to the newsletter that covers list making and how I use it in my own practice in the description or the show notes. And I would love to hear from you if you find the Pomodoro technique interesting and useful in your own creative practice. One of the other things that really helped me out when I was developing my skill set, when I was working in my sketchbook, things like that, is actually a sense of community. It was being around other people and not isolating all the time, where I found if I was working with other artists while they were working on something, I would stick with my pursuits longer. So a sketch that would only be 20 minutes if I was in my bedroom alone would end up being about an hour and a half, right? I would work a lot more on my homework for classes, or if I had a gallery show coming up and I needed to solidify a price list or an artist statement or anything like that. Being around people while we all work on something creatively while we're chatting, it really does help me. And so sometimes it's not about just working with the scheduled time you've given yourself in isolation, but also scheduling group activities where you're more accountable because you have creative peers. I find that it can be inspiring, but also just that commitment to that weekly engagement is just so beneficial. If that sounds interesting and you're looking for an online community, I highly recommend mine, which is the virtual studio. You get behind the scenes access to some podcast stuff, including exclusive episodes, but you also get a lot more. You get access to Still Life Club Plus, which is our complete image archive of monthly still life references, and you get access to in progress material courses, weekly virtual studio hangout sessions to engage in a creative peer activity, and a space to share your work with others in our community space. So if you'd like to keep the conversation going, get involved with a new creative community. In fact, you would be some of the earliest members if you hopped on board now. So you actually would get to help shape it, which is a really cool thing. The link to the virtual studio would be in the description or the show notes. And please reach out if you have any questions. I'd love to hear from you. You can find out more about the Open Sketchbook and everything we have going on online by visiting theopensketchbook.com. You can find us on Instagram at the.open.sketchbook. You can also find us on YouTube and any podcast app, wherever you like to listen to your podcasts. Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Overcast, iHeartRadio, all that good stuff. Amazon, you know. Once again, my name is Evan Kitson. You can find me at evankitson.com, but also at Evan_Kitson on Instagram. And if you've made it this far in the video, please like, subscribe, all that fun YouTube stuff. I'm still new to all this, right? And then if you're on your podcast app, if you feel compelled, please help us out by leaving a review. It means a lot and it really would help us out. Lastly, if I could be so bold, if you are digging the podcast and you think someone else would really like it too, if you could share it with them, I would really appreciate it. There's no better recommendation like word of mouth. All right. Thanks so much for being here. Thanks for listening. I'll see you next week. Take care.